All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving headfirst into a topic that's about as weighty as they come. Rebuilding America's national defense for a new era.
No kidding. This is the big leagues of national security, and we're not just talking hypotheticals here.
Exactly. We're going deep on some very specific, very bold strategies for the future of the U.S. military, and frankly, some of these ideas are going to raise some eyebrows.
Oh, I'm sure of it. Controversy is practically a guarantee when you start talking about shaking up the defense establishment.
Well, get ready for a shakeup, because our source material today pulls no punches. We're going straight to the source. A chapter titled The Common Defense from a book called Mandate for Leadership, The Conservative Promise.
The conservative promise.
Yeah.
That title alone kind of gives you a sense of the perspective we're dealing with here.
Right. But here's the thing. This isn't just some ideological wish list. This chapter is packed with insights from heavy hitters, former government officials, seasoned policy wonks, people who've been in the room where it happens.
So it's not just theory, it's a potential roadmap. These folks have been there, done that, and they're offering up a blueprint for how they think American power should operate in the 21st century.
Exactly. And whether you agree with their conclusions or not, their arguments are definitely worth grappling with. So, are you ready to put on your thinking caps and dive into the minds of these national security strategists?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, so let's cut to the chase. This chapter is all about China. They argue that the U.S. needs a major strategy shift, to put it mildly.
Yeah, they don't mince words, do they? They come right out and say the post-9/11 era, the focus on counterterrorism, that's over. They say the name of the game now is great power competition, and the main rival is China. Full stop.
It's a bold statement. Do you buy it? Is the counterterrorism chapter really closed?
Well, they make a compelling case. The world has changed. China's military and economic power are undeniable. And ignoring that reality is like, well, burying your head in the sand.
Right, and they're not just talking in vague terms about China's growing influence. They drop some pretty startling statistics. Did you know that some analysts believe China could actually surpass America's nuclear arsenal in the very near future?
I did see that, and it's definitely giving a lot of folks pause. I mean, that's not just a military statistic. It's a symbolic shift in the global balance of power.
Exactly, and that's why this chapter feels so urgent. They argue that the U.S. can't just sit back and react. We need to act now, and that means some pretty major changes, like significantly increasing defense spending.
Right, because if you're going to compete with a country like China, a country that's pouring resources into its military, you have to be willing to put your money where your mouth is.
Exactly. And it's not just about spending more, it's about spending smarter. They really hammer home the point that we need to reevaluate our global military commitments, where we station troops, what missions we prioritize.
Right, because resources are finite. You can't be everywhere doing everything all at once. You have to make choices.
And some tough choices at that. So, listener, we're throwing a lot at you, but before we go any further, we want to hear from you. What are your initial thoughts on this? Do you think this dramatic shift towards great power competition is the right move for America? Let us know, because this conversation is just getting started. Okay, so we've established that this chapter sees China as public enemy number one when it comes to, well, everything. But how does that translate to actual changes? You know, boots on the ground, dollars spent, that kind of thing. Where do they want to see things change first?
Well, they start with something you might not expect. Border security.
Border security. That feels pretty specific and a little off topic, honestly. Like, I get that it's important, but how does it relate to China? I thought we were talking about aircraft carriers and hypersonic missiles and, global domination.
You're not wrong. It does seem like a bit of a non sequitur. But they connect the dots by essentially saying a nation that can't even control its own borders can't be expected to protect itself from, well, anything. And they back it up with a pretty shocking number. Did you know that over 100,000 Americans die every year because of drugs coming across the southern border?
Over 100,000. That's more than all the U.S. military casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. That's a staggering statistic. I have to admit, I hadn't put those two things together before. The border and, great power competition.
It definitely makes you think. And their proposed solution is pretty radical. They want to see the Department of Defense, like the actual U.S. military, get involved in supporting Homeland Security at the border.
Wow. Deploying troops domestically, that's sure to ruffle some feathers.
Oh, absolutely. It's a controversial idea, no doubt.
Yeah.
But it shows just how seriously they take border security. They see it as a fundamental component of national security, right up there with, building fighter jets and all that.
It's a whole new way of thinking about defense, that's for sure. And speaking of new ways of thinking, let's talk about their critique of the Pentagon's shall we say, leisurely pace when it comes to actually acquiring new weapons and technology.
Oh, yeah, they don't hold back there.
Right.
They basically say the DoD's procurement process is like watching paint dry in slow motion. Everything takes forever, costs a fortune, and by the time they actually get anything built, it's already obsolete.
It's like trying to win a race with a horse and buggy when everyone else has a Ferrari, right?
Exactly. And they see that as a huge vulnerability, especially when you've got China pumping out new tech at lightning speed.
Yeah.
So they call for a complete overhaul of the system, more agility, more focus on rapid prototyping, and, here's the kicker, a new way to kill off outdated programs. They actually call for a night court.
So Nate Court, like where they put the outdated tanks on trial for being irrelevant?
Pretty much. It's about cutting through the bureaucracy, identifying what's not working, and getting rid of it. No more sacred cows, just ruthless prioritization based on, what's actually going to keep America ahead of the game.
It's a pretty radical proposal, but you have to admit it's kind of refreshing, right? I mean, who hasn't been frustrated by bureaucratic inefficiency?
Right. We've all been there. But whether a night court is the answer or not, they make a good point. We can't afford to be slow and clunky in a world that's moving at warp speed.
Couldn't agree more. So less talk about bureaucracy, more talk about actual weapons systems. Let's get into the weeds a little. What do they say about how to actually equip our fighting forces?
Okay, buckle up, because this is where it gets really interesting. They've got branch-specific recommendations, and they're not shy about throwing out some big ideas.
Hit me with it. Let's start with the Army. They're the tip of the spear, so what needs to change there?
Well, they acknowledge right off the bat that the Army's facing some serious challenges, shrinking budgets, aging equipment, and a recruiting pool that's not exactly overflowing. But they also stress the Army's vital role in any future conflict, especially when it comes to deterring China.
So more money for the Army then, bigger budgets, better recruiting, the usual.
That's part of it, for sure. They definitely call for increased funding. But they also emphasize the need to modernize. And I'm not just talking about, slapping a new coat of paint on a tank. They talk about investing heavily in 6 key areas.
Okay, give me the rundown. What are these 6 areas of focus?
Well, you've got things like long-range precision fires, which is a fancy way of saying being able to hit targets from really far away with incredible accuracy.
Got it. No more lobbing artillery shells and hoping for the best. What else?
Next-generation combat vehicles, think tanks, but way more advanced, tougher, smarter. And then there's future vertical lift capabilities, which basically means helicopters and drones and all sorts of things that fly. And they should be high-tech, too.
So basically, making sure the Army has the best toys on the battlefield, from the ground up to the sky.
Exactly. And it's not just about having cool gadgets. It's about making sure our soldiers have every advantage in a fight, because the stakes are incredibly high.
No arguments here. Okay, land forces, check.
What about the high seas? What do they have to say about the Navy?
Well, hold on to your hats, because this one's big. They want to see a fleet of over 355 ships.
Whoa! 355, that's a lot of ships. For context, I think the Navy's currently at something like, 290-something?
You're in the ballpark. It's a significant increase, but again, their argument comes back to China. They believe that to counter China's growing naval power, especially in the Pacific, we need a bigger fleet, a more visible presence in the region.
So it's about projecting power, showing the flag, letting China know we're not backing down.
Exactly. But it's not just about size. It's also about strategy. And here's where it gets interesting. They propose bringing back something called a general board within the Navy.
A general board? Sounds kind of ominous, like something out of a Tom Clancy novel.
Well, it's actually a fascinating idea, if a little obscure. The general board was this group of really smart naval strategists that existed between the world wars, and they played a key role in guiding the development of the Navy during that period.
So they're saying we need that kind of long-term thinking again, less reactive, more proactive.
Right. Because building a fleet isn't something you do overnight. It takes years, decades even. And they argue that we need a group of dedicated experts, a General Board 2.0, to guide those decisions and make sure we're investing in the right ships and the right technologies for the long haul.
Long game, I like it. But it's not all about ships and planes, is it? We've got to talk about cyber warfare. This chapter talks about how important that is. What do they have to say there?
Oh, they devote a whole section to it. And their main takeaway is, well, it's complicated. The cyber domain is constantly evolving, and what worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. They even quote a line about the war in Ukraine, saying that the conflict has shown that a lot of our assumptions about cyber warfare might be wrong.
Sobering stuff. So what do they suggest we do about it? Just throw our hands up in the air and hope for the best?
Not quite. But they do emphasize the need for humility. and for constant adaptation. They say we need to be willing to rethink our entire approach to cyber warfare based on real-world lessons learned. No more clinging to outdated doctrines or, pretending we have all the answers.
It's a whole new world out there, right? The digital battlefield is just as important as any physical one. And while we're talking about new frontiers, let's not forget about the final frontier space. What do they have to say about the Space Force?
Well, they're definitely keeping an eye on the Space Force, especially given their focus on China. And they actually raised some concerns about the current administration's approach. They think there's been too much emphasis on the defensive side of space and not enough on offensive capabilities.
Interesting. So they want to see the Space Force armed and dangerous.
Essentially, yes. They believe that a credible deterrent in space requires both a strong defense and the ability to project force. They even suggest creating a dedicated Space Force Academy to train the next generation of space warriors.
A Space Force Academy. Now, that's thinking big. But in all this talk of technology and weapons and, dominating the future, I'm curious, do they address the human element at all? Because at the end of the day, none of this matters without the people who actually serve.
Oh, absolutely. They dedicate a whole section to the issue of military personnel. And they sound the alarm, frankly.
In what sense?
Well, they point to declining recruitment rates as a major red flag. It's getting harder and harder to convince young people to sign up, and they worry about the long-term impact that could have on our military readiness.
And why do they think that is? What's driving those declining numbers?
They cite a whole range of factors, from a strong economy to, frankly, a decline in public trust and confidence in the military. They mentioned a poll that found only 45% of Americans have a great deal of confidence in the armed forces.
Wow, 45%, that's pretty low.
It is concerning. And they argue that we can't just ignore it or hope it gets better on its own. We need to actively work to rebuild that trust, to remind Americans of the sacrifices our service members make, and to address the issues that are causing people to lose faith.
So what do they propose? What can be done to turn that tide?
Well, they talk about a bunch of things, from doing a better job of supporting military families to tackling issues like suicide rates within the ranks. They also criticize what they see as the increasing politicization of the military and call for a return to a more neutral, above-the-fray ethos.
It's a lot to unpack, but they make a strong case that investing in our people, the men and women who wear the uniform, is just as important as investing in, the latest and greatest weapon systems.
Couldn't agree more. At the end of the day, a strong national defense relies on strong foundations, and those foundations begin and end with the people who serve. It's a powerful message and a good place to pause.
So much to digest from this chapter. We've gone from, literally guarding borders to fighting wars in cyberspace and space. Kind of mind-blowing, right?
It really is. But for all the ground this chapter covers, I keep coming back to one word: responsibility. They really hammer it home.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The sheer weight of the decisions our leaders have to make when it comes to national security, it's pretty daunting when you stop and think about it. And they don't let you forget it either. That last line of the chapter is burned into my brain.
Oh, tell me about it. It's like they saved the most intense thought for last. The next president has the opportunity to restructure U.S. defense and foreign policy and reset the nation's role in the world. Heavy stuff.
No kidding. Talk about pressure. It's like they're saying the future of America, for better or worse, rests on these decisions about national defense. It's not just about military strength. It's about, who we are as a country, what we stand for in the world.
It's a huge responsibility. And it makes you realize that these aren't just intellectual exercises, policy wonk debates in some ivory tower. These choices have real-world consequences for all of us.
Absolutely. What we choose to prioritize, what we invest in, how we support the people who put their lives on the line, all of it. It matters. It ripples outward.
And that's what I find so compelling about this chapter. It connects those dots. It reminds us that national security isn't some abstract concept. It's about protecting our people, our values, our way of life.
Exactly. And it's something we all have a stake in, even if we never wear the uniform.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to be informed, to engage in these conversations, even if they're tough or uncomfortable sometimes.
Well said. So to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We've covered a ton of ground today, explored some really challenging issues, and hopefully sparked some important conversations along the way.
We've looked at how the world is changing, how technology is reshaping the battlefield, and how crucial it is to support the brave men and women who defend our nation. It's a lot to process, but remember, knowledge is power.
Couldn't agree more. This deep dive might be over, but the conversation never really ends, does it? Keep asking those tough questions, keep seeking out different perspectives, and never underestimate the importance of staying informed. Until next time, keep diving deep.